Welcome to the Real Life Overtime Podcast, the place where the members of the Real Life Ministries sermon team go deeper into the weekend sermon. Watch them as they unpack, unfold, and unravel the weekend sermon like never before. So fasten your seatbelts, hit play, and join us for Real Life Overtime, where every episode is an adventure and this sermon doesn't end on Sunday.
Hello, thanks for joining us with this edition of our Overtime Podcast, where we get to discuss the sermon that was preached this last weekend at our 4 campuses. I'm Craig Miles, one of the executive pastors here on staff. I'm joined by Gabe Cleave, our Hayden campus pastor. He preached in Hayden this week. Chris Short, another one of our executive pastors who preached in Post Falls, and Christian Putman, the adult ministries pastor at the Coeur d'Alene campus where he preached. And we are discussing the topic of blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And I know that for all of us, a couple of things that we talked about is what does it look like to mourn our own sin? But then because we live in a broken world, broken by sin, there are many circumstances that we find ourselves in that we mourn as well. Gabe, what were some of the highlights of things that either you hit in the message or things that people talked to you about afterwards that were impactful?
Yeah, one of the major things that I talked about was in our culture. I know, Chris, you talked about this as well. In our culture, we do everything we can to try to avoid mourning. And so there's industries that are built upon getting people to get their mourning and their pain off of that. And so, but looking at it, like Jesus actually said, blessed are you who mourn, happy are you who mourn. It's like Jesus saying happy is the sad. And so we looked at that and said, okay, either our view of mourning is incorrect or Jesus was wrong. Which one is it? It's got to be that our view of mourning is incorrect. So what we talked about was how mourning and joy aren't mutually exclusive. Like those two things can coexist, can happen at the same time. And we wrestled through the passage in 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18, where it says, be joyful in all circumstances, or always be joyful, never stop praying, give thanks in all circumstances. And I just talked about how for years I wrestled with that passage of going, how do you be thankful in this? How do you be joyful in this? And the word that just made it so crystal clear to me in that passage that made all the sense in the world is the word in. It doesn't say be thankful for. I can rejoice in a circumstance. I can be thankful in a circumstance. I don't have to rejoice for or be thankful for that circumstance, that mourning, that grieving, that loss. So I can learn to be thankful in. Now, I think this is kind of what I proposed to our congregation at Hayden was kind of the starting place is being thankful in and being joyful in a hardship and in that circumstance. As you're mourning, you can be thankful and joyful in it. What I've learned, and I think we'll talk about this later in the podcast, what I've learned is I can actually get to a place where I am thankful for it as well. Mm-hmm. And I can look back and be thankful for what God brought me through. In the moment, I go, okay, God, I'm just choosing to be thankful in it right now. But I look back and see the faithfulness of God. I see what God did for me in it. I look at what James says, where he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you fall into trials of many kinds, because you're going to become mature and your faith is going to be tested. And you're going to become mature in that, And so I look back on trials and go, God, thank you for allowing me to go through that because it helped shape who I am today. In the moment, I'm going, okay, God, I'm choosing just to be thankful in this right now, not for it. And so we kind of looked at those things and just went, joy, sorrow, they can exist at the same time. It doesn't have to be I'm either feeling this or I'm feeling this. It can be this combination and this chaotic combination, I'll say, of the two of them together living in harmony.
Yeah, really good. Chris, what about your message here in Post Falls?
Yeah, I think one of the key themes that I came back to a lot was the perspective that we have as humans on this earth and the perspective that the Lord has. Back to Isaiah 55, we've used a few times, my thoughts are not his thoughts, my ways not his ways. And I know in my life, it's the things that I can't see over and kind of use the analogy of there are peaks and there's pits in our life that we all have. There's things that are mountaintop moments, the wedding, the, graduation, the new baby, job promotion. These are all really exciting things, but it seems like in those pits, a lot of times the opposite. of some of those highlights, the lost relationship, the lost job, the hurt, that we actually see from that depth. We see God a little clearer, and we actually trust in him a little bit more because we recognize that he actually sees over the hill that we can't in that moment. So that was just a key part of my message, was the mourning in our life really draws us to have a deeper faith and trust, just like we saw a lot of the writers of Scripture. I talked about David and Psalm 23 and Psalm 57, when he's hiding in a cave and he can't see anything, but he says, "Have mercy on me, God. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings." And that, for me, gives me kind of confidence that while I don't know what's over the next hill or even where the end of the valley might be, he does. And when I'm anchored to him as the, one I take refuge in, that I actually have strength. So
it's good.
It's really good. How about you, Christian?
Yeah, it was a good message. I think for me, some of the points that I hit was that we're in a fallen world. And because of the fallen world, there's so many ways that we face in mourning. It could be loss. It could be, a dream that died. It could be a death. It could be disease. In all those things, although it is hard, that we have Jesus, who is our high priest, who left his divine privileges and became one of us, and it says that he understands us, that we can go boldly before him to find strength when we need it most. And in all those things, although they're hard and we don't understand, we can look through the lenses of what Jesus has done and know that in the process, we have a God who actually invites us to come and bring that before him. We talked about in that also mourning sin, that as we follow Christ, we realize that I'm broken. And God knows that I'm broken, and he actually invites me to mourn that. And he doesn't say you have to have it figured out and perfect, but you can mourn your sin. And we talked about Ezra, who cried out for the people, but he also cried out with his own sins. He says, our sins has reached higher than the heavens. And he had a sacrifice that was sufficient. But then we talked about comfort, because it bless those who comfort. And we talked about how comfort isn't always comfortable. Comfort doesn't always mean it's comfortable. Paul says in that verse that God comforts us so we can comfort others, that we're called to, as God comforted us, to comfort others. But then he also says that he was crushed and overwhelmed beyond his ability to endure. And if that is a apostle who says that, then I believe that we will have that, and that is okay, but that in that, although comfort isn't always comfortable, it doesn't take away the moments where you feel crushed, but he says in and through that, he's going to comfort us through his presence, through his people, and he invites us in the word of mourning is actually, the definition in there is, one of them is lament. So we talked about, what does it mean to lament? What does it mean to bring your anger, your questions, your I don't knows, your God, what are you doing, to God and cry out to him? And oftentimes in that, our perspective shifts and we go, but God, you're so good. That's Psalm 77. So we kind of went through a journey of all the ways in which we mourn, our own sin in which we mourn, that God comforts. Sometimes that means comfort isn't always comfortable, but that God promises to work through that. And then in that, he gives us ways to do that. So that was kind of the journey we went on.
Really good. Yeah, we talked about really the reason we mourn is something is not how we think it should be. And there's a lot of reasons to mourn in this world. We were built for perfection. In the garden, it was perfect. We were in perfect relationship with each other, with God. Then sin enters the world, and now all of creation's broken, Romans says. All of creation mourns and waits for the day when God will reconcile everything to the way it should be. But God does use our mourning for good. And I'd love to hear from you guys, how has that happened in your life? I know in my life, the times where I've had the deepest and greatest mourning are actually times where God has showed up in the most amazing ways. In one situation in my life, it was really the first time I'd gone through anything hard in my life, because it caused me to cry out to God, and I had to dig in to my relationship with God. Even today, 30 years later, I hear God in ways that I hadn't prior to that time. How I communicate with God changed. And in another situation in our family that was super hard for for both my wife and I. It was one of the first times where the church became even more real to us in the ways that our staff and our friends walked alongside of us in our mourning. And so just to hear how maybe circumstances that you've mourned, God has used in your life to be a benefit to, like Gabe said, maybe in the moment, we aren't glad in it or glad for it. We're glad in it. But really, I can look back now and go, I'm glad for those circumstances that we went through because of what it shaped in my life. But love to hear from you guys.
I think one of the things we were all surprised by was just in talking about mourning, how many people in our church are in the middle of something that they are real time, mourning and feeling. And it's kind of obvious, but I think we were all a little bit like, oh, wow, there's, with thousands of people, there just are going to be a lot of situations that, we can talk theoretically about it, but for a lot of people, they're really in the middle of something. And, at the same time, we all can look back and say, here's those pits in my life that I've had times that I was more reliant than others. And I can just say for myself, probably the most vivid for me was going through 7-8 years ago, a journey of cancer and seeing God's faithfulness and my reliance on him hadn't ever felt that real in my life. Until that time when it was like kind of a life or death. It's like, do I really believe that what I believe is real? And just in my life, and me and my wife praying and crying through that, and my daughters being aware of it, that was brutal. But I think the way that I looked at challenges after that became different because I truly knew, okay, my faith is established. I've been a believer for my whole life, since I was 12 years old. But that was a moment that I think was most vividly real in my faith, was journeying through the unknown and uncertainty of cancer.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah, I shared this story. I've shared it before. My wife was on her deathbed 15 years ago, and 7 months after we got married, and that was the time in my life where it was like my faith was solidified as well. And I was sharing that story, and I told. This wasn't an immediate, like you get through kind of the initial shock of like what's going on. The doctors come in and tell you, and we don't know what's going on. Your wife's declining, and there's no brain activity, and this virus is eating her away. And in the initial shock of that, you're just like, okay, Lord, what has happened? You kind of try to wrap your brain around it for a second. But then there's like this moment where like I was sharing that passage in 2 Corinthians 1 where it's like, he's the God of all comfort. He's a merciful Father. He comforts us in all of our sorrow, right? So we can comfort others. And I was sharing that in the midst of the hardest thing that I ever went through in my life of learning that I was going to lose my wife of 7 months. That came with all of our dreams, our hopes, our plans, our future, our kids, our family. Like all that was in my mind was going away. The peace and the hope and I'll even say the joy that I had in the midst of sorrow was, I used the word, it was palpable. Like I could feel it, like almost as if God was with me in that moment, and like I could feel the presence of God in this moment. And in the moment, I wasn't like, oh Lord, thank you that my wife is on her deathbed. But in the moment, I could go, Lord, thank you that you're still good and that you're still here and that you're in control. And I remember having these conversations with God and looking back on that now. It took my wife a little longer to get there because, but we look back now and I go, man, Lord, thank you that you let us go through that. And thank you that you use that in our life to grow us up and to truly solidify our faith. Because when the enemy attacks me and you're not truly, I'm like, I feel like I've gone through something with the Lord where my faith has been tested and it continues to be. But I can look back on that and it's assurance for me that I'm not just like a fair weather Christian. Like I truly, not that I was proving something, but I was like, oh, Lord, I'm in, I'm in. And so through that, over the last however many years it's been since that, I've been able to come alongside lots of people that are going through tragedies and heartaches and hardships and physical struggles and cancers and all those things. And while that didn't happen to me, it happened to my wife. And I can walk alongside someone and I can go, man, this is what God showed me in that moment. And I'm not going to throw the Romans 8:28 passage that God works all things together for. I'm not going to throw that at you, but I will say this though: coming on the other side of that, man, God used it huge in my life, and He's used it in other people's. I had someone come up to me after the sermon, and they said, I'm sure that God has used that before, but thank you for sharing that because He just used it today. And so it was cool.
It's really good. Yeah, I got to share this story. A lot of people have heard it, but I was an addict for a long time and came to the Lord and got into ministry. And years into being sober, I started having like really bad mental illness stuff happen, and they don't know if that was some in my family or probably the drugs that I did for so many years. And I had to step back. And Craig, you remember this? You guys walked this with me, and Gabe and everybody. And I went to a mental health facility, and they after about a month, they sat me down, the doctors, and they said, "You're never going to work again. You're not going to be in ministry. You're probably going to be permanently disabled because of the mental illness that was so severe." And I went to my dad, and when I asked him, I don't know what to do. And he said, "Don't look at your circumstances and what people are saying or what you see." He said, "You can't trust your own emotions right now when it's foggy, and you can't believe what you're thinking. They say that you can't provide, God will provide. You feel anxiety, and God is with you." And for me, it became so real of, am I going to believe what I can see and think and feel, or am I going to believe what God's word says? And I remember when I got back, there was like 1 million people from the church who like redid our pavement and did all this stuff while I was away. And it would have been easy for a church to go, "Hey, you're done. Like, we love you, but you," and they just rallied. Like, the church was the church. And not only did they not, they helped me and supported me. And obviously it didn't pan out that way. God did a lot of work in my life. And I'd like to say though that every day I mourn it a little bit, because it's gotten way better and God heals, but there's a little bit of mourning every day because I still have mental illness that I battle, and I have to mourn that. But man, as we talk about God comforting us so we can comfort others, I can't tell you how many times I get to encourage people, man, like, rely on what God says and God's people and His presence, and trust Him. He's with you. And so for me, man, I don't know if I could even say I'm grateful for that. Some of you guys did. I'm like, I don't know if I'm grateful for it, but I look back and I can see how God used it. And I guess I am grateful because He led me through something. So.
Last question. We've kind of referenced it. 2 Corinthians 1 talks about we go through the things that we go through so that we can comfort others. Galatians 6 talks about the fact that we carry each other's burdens. How do you do that? How do you walk alongside somebody who's mourning? How do you carry somebody else's burden when they're mourning? What's that look like for you? What are challenges in that?
Yeah, I certainly think the circumstances we just talked about can help. It's like having or knowing someone who's gone through cancer can be an encouragement. At the same time, I think God uses His church collectively, even when someone hasn't directly went through that thing, just because of the love of Christ that is shared, and even just the analogy that I used of peaks and pits, that there are people all along that spectrum in their life of different moments that, there are some that are in the middle of deep suffering, and it's harder for them to be an encouragement to others when they're in that deep suffering. And there are some who are in a moment where they're encouraged and they're doing well, and they have, like, life is in a good season, we'll call it, that they can come around those that are, hurting in a different way. And I think that's one of the values of just our church, and that we have so many relational environments across our ministries and small groups and campuses, that really you put people who are like-minded, that care about each other, and they really are caring for the best interest of everyone. And I think that just puts us in the right environment to have people who are genuine and care.
For me personally, I have to remember that Scripture says that we have a high priest that sympathizes with our weaknesses, right? So God sympathizes with us, and I want to sympathize with other people, but I think that God's also empathetic with us. Like, God doesn't sympathize and going, I know how you feel, and that's hard. He actually goes, I'm going to empathize with you. I'm going to get down in it with you. And so it's easier for me to sympathize with people than it is to empathize. And so I got to remember, like, it's not always about making them feel better. It's about actually taking on what they're feeling. And so instead of trying to fix them and go, well, if you just remember this, or this is what helped me, and trying to fix, I actually have to go, I need to actually feel what you're feeling and take on what you're feeling and walk with you through this, not just to, because ultimately fixing you is so I don't have to feel what you're feeling. For me, and so I gotta be more empathetic and walk alongside and let people grieve and let them mourn and let them cry and let them show emotion and be angry and be frustrated and like let them actually experience the full emotions of what they're feeling, and then go, okay, but we can't stay there. Like, it's okay that you're feeling that, but now let's figure out what we do to move past that and how do we move on. That's where the journey comes in, and I just had some really amazing people in my life that have come alongside me in that and gone, hey, it's okay. It's okay that you're angry. It's okay that you're frustrated. It's okay that you're sad. It's okay that you're confused. But let's journey through this, And so, for anyone watching, I'm imagining that we have people watching that now that are going through that hardship. And if I could just tell them anything, it's like, it's okay that you're feeling that, but you gotta find that person who's gonna be able to empathize with you in it and then help you get out of it. Not stay in that pit.
Yeah, for sure.
That's good. Yeah, I think for me, when I look back at people who have really encouraged me, is they were vulnerable themselves. And when I see, I'm not the only broken person, which means, am I going to be vulnerable with people? Like, I don't have it all figured out. And, man, I got doubts. And, the concept of lament for me was so huge because it's an outpouring of anguish and questions and frustrations. And even, you look at the Psalms, even people with God, like, they question God, where are you? And he's perfect. But the reality of us sharing our stuff with that, there's so much freedom. And I believe so many people came up because just hearing all your guys' messages, like, you guys all shared your stories and what you went through, which then helped people go, man, I have stuff that I'm mourning. And so this whole concept of bearing with each other and being vulnerable and not only encouraging, but sharing what you're struggling with. So many people, for me, when they've done that, has given me freedom to actually share, like, okay, I'm not the only one who's messed up here, and we can do that together. And when we do that, I think it allows people to go, okay, I can actually share my stuff, and God, I think, works through that. So.
Yeah. And it's hard both ways, right?
Oh, yeah.
I like to fix.
Yeah.
Most of the time, there's nothing I can do to fix their broken relationship or the fact that they had somebody they loved that passed away or whatever. And honestly, they don't need me to fix that. That's God's job to help them through that. But just like Gabe said, to actually join them in it, I'm always surprised at when I go, man, that's hard. That really stinks. I'm sorry. How much that does for a person, and just realizing that's sometimes all I can do, but it's what's needed. But also the inviting other people in. And I would just say, if you're somebody that is mourning right now and you're mourning alone, you're not supposed to be doing that. Scripturally, it makes it clear that we are supposed to be on this journey together. The church is supposed to come alongside each other. So if that's you today, my encouragement would just be to let the church be the church and come alongside you. They might not be able to fix your circumstances, but they can join you in your mourning and helping to carry the burdens, again, like Galatians 6 says. And just want to say thanks to you guys for joining us, and thanks to you for joining us on this edition of the Overtime Podcast. We'll see you next time.